Good evening. In the first part of this series on the historical roots of Russian communism, we explored the background that prepared the environment and the conditions that turned the Russia of 19th century into a grand prelude for the 1917 revolution. I made reference in particular to the reform of Peter the Great in the 1700s and those of his successor Catherine the Great. Reforms that, in one way, made the state more efficient, but in another, further increased the class divide between the elite and the bureaucracy on one side and the large masses of the dispossessed on the other. We should keep in mind that land serfdom in Russia was only eliminated in 1861 by the Tsar Alexander II. And by the ironic coincidences of history, the abolition of serfdom occurred in the same year when the American Civil War began. As we saw in the previous episode, almost until the end of the 19th century, the Tsar appeared at large as an almost hieratic and messianic figure. In the collective perception of the masses, he was the friend of the dispossessed, surrounded by a cadre of dispirited and selfish bureaucrats. But in time, at least this was the collective hope anyway, the Tsar would free himself from the bureaucratic weight and bring relief and solace to the people. As we also saw before, the connection between the Orthodox Church and the people in Russia was strong and of a quite different nature than, for example, the connection between the Catholics and the Pope. Perhaps with some arbitrariness, we could say that the Orthodox Church was the spiritual side of government more than the Catholic Church could be the spiritual side of government. And the same thing for the Protestants, even in England, where the king or the queen are the heads of the church. But this connection of the Tsar with the people and the peasants, his messianic nature would inevitably fade, notably at the end of the 19th century, under the pressure of internal and external forces. Anyway, the origins of Russian communism are connected with a phenomenon that was important enough to have become part of the international lingo, and I refer to the word intelligentsia or intelligentsia. It is no coincidence that even in the West, the Slavic term intelligentsia has been literally transposed to identify a phenomenon originally Russian. It would be easy to associate the term intelligentsia with the term intellectuals, but the meanings are quite different. What is the difference between intellectuals and intelligentsia? Intellectuals are defined, as you know, as learned people, such as writers, professors, teachers, and whatnot. But the Russian intelligentsia was an entirely different group, to which may belong people not occupied in intellectual work, and even non-intellectuals, or at least not the usual types whom we call intellectuals in Western Europe and in America. An image that may perhaps describe the Russian intelligentsia by comparison is a monastic order, with its own intolerant views, a generally shared view on life, and whose members sometimes even have in common certain physical characteristics or appearance. To form the intelligentsia were individuals from different social classes, and they shared an idea or ideas, but did not share, say, a profession or social or economic status. The Russian intelligentsia, like most human initiatives or customs, evolved in time. It started with the more cultured section of the nobility at the beginning of the 19th century. Then there were added some government officials, some of the clergy, and members from the lower middle classes. And after the peasant liberation in 1861, even peasants became part of the intelligentsia. But as the 19th century proceeded, the tone, the temper, and the spirit of the intelligentsia changed quite dramatically. At the end of the century, radicalism and anarchism were the defining characteristics of the Russian intelligentsia. Dostoevsky called the character of the Russian revolutionary that was taking shape in the 19th century. He called it the great wanderer of the Russian land. The Russian intelligentsia lived, or was able to live and nourish itself by ideas alone. There were assemblies where members got together to daydream of social change. Contrast that to today's, for example, movements or NGOs, non-government organizations, which are heavily financed by what we call, for simplicity, the deep state. But in Russia it was different. Given the impossibility of political action, politics were transferred to thought and to literature. Much, we could say, as it happens with many changes, of course, with the internet today, except that today the intelligentsia, or some may say the lack of it, is the world. But there is perhaps an even greater difference. In today's America, the forgers of political and cultural thought at large are Hollywood and television on one hand, and mass sports on the other. Or rather, we could say, somewhat pessimistically, the numbing provided by the ideology of mass entertainment has been so successful that so far it has dwarfed in its impact whatever impact the internet intelligentsia, if we can call it that way, whatever impact the internet intelligentsia may have. Perhaps it will change, and maybe this is why the ruling cabal is so concerned about the censoring of the internet at large. But in 19th century Russia, the leaders of social and political thought were not Hollywood producers. They were often serious literary figures, philosophers and critics. That one key characteristic of the Russian intelligentsia was its sectarianism is indubitable, but sectarianism is one identifiable character of the Russian soul, as we discussed in the previous episode. Also, in some ways, the intolerance of the Russian intelligentsia was self-protective. The world outside was hostile, at times brutal, and dogmatism may have been a trait of the Russian spirit. But dogmatism, along with social motives and a revolutionary frame of mind, created eventually the type of man whose particular specialty was, indeed, revolution. It could be generalized that Russians, at least those we are talking about in the 19th century, were inclined to take things in a totalitarian sense, and that skeptical criticism, which is part of the non-Russian Western culture, European culture anyway, was alien to them. Consequently, the Russian intelligentsia embraced with vigor and enthusiasm all the various currents of thought that found their ways into Russia, and I'm referring in particular to the French Saint-Simon, Fourier, the German Hegel, and materialism, and of course Karl Marx. A Russian thinker wrote that the Russian spirit craves for wholeness. It cannot reconcile itself to the classification of everything according to categories. It aims at the absolute. Everything should be part of this absolute, which again is characteristics of a strong religious temperament. But the strong absolutistic spirit can transfer the religious energy connected with the idea of the absolute, as I said, to non-religious ideas, areas, or objects, which perhaps explains why the Soviet regime was absolutistic. For the previous regime, the Tsarist regime, it was equally absolutistic too. And with the usual reservations, absolutism was and maybe is a characteristic of the Russian nation. There is no value judgment here, I'm just making a personal observation. Furthermore, it does not mean necessarily that all is bad with absolutism, for when there is no Tsar or king to rule, the next best ruler is money. And personally, I am not sure which of these absolutes, king, Tsar or money, are preferable for the rest of us. The first exponent of the 19th century Russian intelligentsia we will talk about was a gentleman called Radishchev, a writer who lived from 1749 to 1802. Catherine the Great had him arrested and condemned to death, later converted to exile. For he had written a book titled A Journey from Petersburg to Moscow, in which he wrote movingly about being wounded by the suffering of humanity. The book could be interpreted as a criticism of the regime, and Radishchev could be described as the forerunner of the revolutionary intelligentsia and Russian socialism. Radishchev and others like him had absorbed the readings and the teachings of the French philosophers, or philosophes as they called them, Voltaire, Diderot and Rousseau. And so had Catherine the Great, who kept a lively correspondence with Diderot, the brain behind the famous French encyclopedia. Besides, she considered herself as a modern, illuminated social ruler for having absorbed the spirit and the practice of the Enlightenment. But as you probably agree, the same idea can often suffer dramatically different interpretations among different people. Anyway, the beginning of the Russian intelligentsia saw enlightened people surrounded by unenlightened people, and this included part of the nobility, which often at the beginning was illiterate. The state of affair can perhaps be concisely summarized by the title of a book by a Russian author and member of the intelligentsia. His name was Chatsky, and the book title was The Misfortune of Being Too Wise. As I mentioned, the Russian intelligentsia of the 19th century included a large number of characters, authors, writers, poets, intellectuals, each one of which influenced the current of thought that eventually led to the bloody revolution of 1917. To include them all here would be impossible. Therefore, I am forced to make selections, and of course each selection is reductive, but my objectives are two. One, to give a flavor of the social temper of the period, and two, to inspire the curious, if you like, to conduct their own independent researches. However obvious is what I say now, I will still say it. The more we know about history, the less dogmatic we tend to become about our conviction. Because dogmatism acts like a wall, almost impenetrable to reason. Lack of dogmatism, on the other hand, does not imply equal acceptance of different ideas or explanations, but it gives all of us, potential truth seekers, if you like, some better truths to arrive, if not at the truth, at least to a better informed opinion. As we say, the 19th century Russian intelligentsia was divided into Westernizer on one hand and Slavophiles on the other, Slavophiles. In turn, the Slavophiles can be divided into different subgroups. Broadly speaking, the Westernizers felt that Russia had all to learn from the West, and the Slavophiles felt that notwithstanding serfdom, poverty, and the absolutism of the Russian Empire, a radical change in the administration of society at large, even in the West, could only come from Russia, given her unique social and cultural characteristics. Another factor influencing many of the protagonists of the Russian intelligentsia was the Romantic movement in art and especially literature. It is difficult for us to realize how much literature affected the thoughts and the feelings of our 19th century European predecessors. But this is so because in our times, rather than literature, it is Hollywood, the undisputed forger of ideologies, if you like. And Hollywood's output is an endless concentrate of disgusting, murderous, pornographic, aberrant, and frankly revolting productions. It is a top-down imposed ideology masquerading as popular taste. But the Hollywood of 19th century were books filled with romantic ideals and ideas, embodied, for example, by the novel or in the novels of George Sand, who used a male pseudonym while she was actually a French woman. George Sand, a romantic forerunner of feminism, had an immense influence in shaping the spiritual and emotional life of Russian cultural circles. Coupled with that, there was the lingering yearning for a natural life as embodied by the writings of Rousseau, ideas that survived the bitter realities of the French and of the subsequent European Revolution of the 19th century. By and large, the Russian intelligentsia envisioned three forms in the evolution and execution of Russia, or the execution and evolution of Russia into a socialist country: the stage of utopian socialism, the state of so-called narodnik socialism, that is a program of massive political propaganda among the peasantry that would lead to the awakening of the masses, and through their influence to the liberalization of the Tsarist regime. And finally, the third was the scientific or Marxist socialism. One member of the Russian intelligentsia chosen for this brief survey and representative of utopian socialism was Mikhail Petrashevsky. He was a typical Russian landowner whose soul was on fire with utopian socialism, and I quote one sentence of his to give you an idea of his frame of mind. "Unable to find anything either in men or women worthy of my adherence, I have turned to devote myself to the service of humanity." The statement reflects one other aspect of the Russian revolutionary intelligentsia: the love of the man for far away as opposed to the love of the man nearby, the love of one's neighbor. Anyway, Petrashevsky gave practical form to his plan by setting up a phalanstery, which was a curious form of commune built on the model described by the French social reformer Charles Fourier, who is also credited for having coined the word feminism. Today we would probably classify Charles Fourier as a cultural Marxist without the dreadful, obnoxious and extractive connotations associated with cultural Marxism, of which we see and live through the effects today, especially in the West. Petrashevsky built indeed his own simple phalanstery, that is, a type of building designed for a self-contained utopian community, ideally consisting of 500 to 1,000 people working together for mutual benefit. The name was a combination of the French word phalange or phalanx, the basic military unit in ancient Greece, with the word monastere or monastery. Petrashevsky built his phalanstery for the peasants, but the peasants were totally unimpressed and quickly burnt the phalanstery down. Needless to say, the type of Petrashevsky's initiative was extremely dangerous in the autocratic and absolutist atmosphere of 19th century Russia. Dostoevsky himself was part of Petrashevsky's group, and the peaceful gatherings of these utopian socialists ended badly. All its members were arrested, 21 were condemned to death, with their sentence commuted to penal servitude. Dostoevsky himself lived within minutes of being executed before the reprieve. The experience was not totally useless for literature, for one of Petrashevsky's utopian socialists was the model for one of the main characters in his classic The Devils, sometimes translated also as The Possessed. Nevertheless, the repression of Petrashevsky's movement, rather than quench, it strengthened the resolve of other budding revolutionaries, and one of the first Marxists in Paris was actually a Russian landowner called Sazonov at the end of the 1840s. Marx, who in general did not like Russia, was quite surprised, and in a letter to Engels he told him that his first supporters were actually Russians. There were a large number of Russian intellectuals, both Westernizers and Slavophiles, involved in the social and political questions affecting the future and the destiny of Russia. Many, or most, could express their thoughts outside of Russia only, for in Russia the regime was quite harsh, especially under Nicholas I, who had begun his reign by suppressing the revolt of the Decembrists, so-called because they rebelled in the month of December 1825. It happened when Russian army officers led about 3,000 soldiers in a protest against Tsar Nicholas I's assumption to the throne after his elder brother Constantine had removed himself from the line of succession. A few were executed, the rest exiled to Siberia. Among the Russian intellectuals making their views and projects known in Western Europe, I will choose two: Alexander Herzen and Mikhail Bakunin. Herzen, whose life I will concisely describe, shows several traits or characteristics of those who contributed to prepare the ground for the communist revolution. Herzen started as a westernizer, moved to Europe, was disappointed, not to say disgusted, by the reaction of the bourgeoisie to the revolutions of 1848 to 1849 in Paris. And unable to return to Russia, he ended his life as a convinced Slavophile. Experience, indeed, molds opinions and beliefs, you may agree. And the life of Herzen and other members of the Intellighentsia also shows the structure of society in Russia, of their related curious customs, in turn associated and derived from the practice of peasant serfdom, which, as I said, only ended in 1861. Herzen's life shows how contorted, for lack of a better word, were the relationships between men and women who belonged to the upper classes. People who could also easily move around with house and family throughout Russia and Europe in an era where the only mode of transportation were horses and coaches. Herzen wrote a monumental biography whose English title is My Past and Thoughts. However, the English historian Edward Carr has written a most legible and interesting book that summarizes Herzen's biography titled The Romantic Exiles. This book makes it easier to follow the life of an extraordinary character and of a series of other interesting people that moved within his circle and family. Together, they provide a kind of movie of the mind, if you like, showing what the life of the Russian exiles in Europe in the 19th century was. Herzen was born out of wedlock to a rich Russian landowner by the name of Ivan Yakovlev and to a young German Protestant woman. Yakovlev supposedly gave his son the surname Herzen because he was a child of his heart, Herz in German meaning heart. He was born in Moscow shortly before Napoleon's invasion of Russia and brief occupation of the city. His father, after a personal interview with Napoleon, was allowed to leave Moscow after agreeing to bear a letter from Napoleon to the Tsar in Petersburg. Herzen studied at the university, and in 1834 he and his lifelong friend Nikolai Ogarev were arrested and tried on charges of having attended a festival during which songs uncomplimentary to the Tsar were sung, which should tell us something about the climate for free expression in the 1830s in Russia. Found guilty, he was banished to northeastern Russia, where he remained 3 years, and in 1837 he eloped with Natalia Zakharina, secretly marrying her. To give you an idea of the relationships, his wife was actually his first cousin, the daughter of his uncle, who also was a wealthy landowner with 500 souls, or peasants as they were called, in his possession. He held what the Arabs would call a harem of peasant women who bore him an unspecified number of children, among whom there was to be the wife of Herzen. What changed the fate of Natalia? Once her father brought her to Petersburg to visit his sister, who was another wealthy woman of the family. The sister took a fancy to Natalia, kept her in Petersburg, where she was educated and groomed to become a member of the upper classes. In 1846, Herzen's father died, leaving him a large amount of property. The next year, Herzen emigrated with his wife, mother, and children, never to return to Russia. He went first to Italy, from where, on hearing of the revolution of 1848 in Paris, he moved to Paris. He supported the revolutions of 1848, but was bitterly disillusioned with the European socialist movements after their failure. He found the Western proletariat cowardly and the bourgeoisie repulsive in its misdeeds and massacres conducted to retain its own privileges. They, the bourgeois, were as bad as the aristocrats who wanted to retain the privileges by right of birth. Disappointed with Paris, Herzen and family moved first to Switzerland. His wife, Natalia, gave him 4 live children, And then his wife carried an affair, long-standing affair with a German poet who was married, but whose wife actually encouraged this relationship. And the life of these guys, as I was saying before, reads like a twisted plot of a surrealist Hollywood movie. Natalia eventually died of tuberculosis in 1852 in Nice, and Herzen then moved to Geneva and then to London, where he settled for many years. It is here, in London, that he gained his reputation as a major contributor to the movement that led eventually to the 1917 revolution. In 1856, he was joined in London by his old friend Nikolai Ogarev and by Ogarev's wife, another Natalia. Nikolai had also had issues with the Tsarist police after the events that got Herzen exiled in Russia. Soon Herzen began an affair with Ogarev's wife, who was called Natalia Tuchkova. Tuchkova bore Herzen 3 more children, who were listed, however, as children of Ogarev. The situation did not break the friendship between Ogarev and Herzen. In turn, Ogarev befriended a prostitute in London and married her. Involved with the International Workingmen's Association, Herzen became well acquainted with revolutionary circles and characters including the likes of Bakunin and Marx. At the time, London was a hotbed of revolutionaries from all over Europe, and some of the countries we take for granted in Europe today were born actually in the 19th century, Italy and Greece, just to name 2. The 2 friends, Herzen and Ogarev, founded a new Russian language periodical called Kolokol, meaning the bell. With his publications, Herzen wanted to influence Russian politics and improve the situations of the Russian peasants. His newspapers acquired notoriety in London, Europe, and of course Russia, where they were actually banned by smuggled in. But when Alexander II freed the peasants from serfdom, Herzen was ecstatic. That was the peak of his popularity even for his newspaper. Newspaper, as I said, was banned but smuggled into Russia and read at large. But soon Alexander II turned reactionary, and once more Herzen became disappointed. In 1864, he went again to Geneva and then Paris, where he died in 1870 of tuberculosis. Originally buried in Paris, his remains were taken to Nice, a city that from Italian had become French through the twists and turns of history. Next time we will hopefully conclude our series on the Russian roots of communism by examining the life of Bakunin and possibly a few other influential members of the Intellighentsia. Until then, I am Jimmy Moglia for Historical Sketches. Good night.